All right, I'm going to launch the conversation today. For those who haven't joined one of our webinars before, my name is Donald MacKay. I'm the CEO and founder of XA Global Trade Advisors. With me today is Paul Bondi, the co-head and managing director of Rothschild and Company, South Africa. A big thank you to Acess Bank for once again sponsoring the series of webinars. If you have any banking requirements, financing requirements, cross-border transaction assistance, please get hold of Acess Bank, and the contact details will be at the end of this presentation. So today we're talking about a topic that I think is incredibly important. That is the whole question of our localization as part of our industrial policy and its impact on investment. And I've asked Paul to join me because Paul has been on the banking side of M&A transactions where localization and industrial policy has played a pivotal role inside of the transactions. And so we're going to have a conversation today, more than it's going to be any kind of lecture being delivered. However, you do have to suffer through a couple of slides before we open up the conversation. And so I'd like to kick off by just talking about what localization is. And localization sits inside this thing which we call industrial policy. And trying to get a proper, useful definition of industrial policy turns out to be quite a challenging task, but let me give you the best that I could find. Any type of intervention or government policy that attempts to improve the business environment or to alter the structure of economic activity towards sectors, technologies, or tasks that are expected to offer better prospects for economic growth or societal welfare than would occur in the absence of such intervention. So that's kind of the intention behind industrial policy. But the question would then be, what is the alternative to an industrial policy? And this would be simply the market making its collective decisions on where things go, or something that some economists also call the profit and loss model. And so with the profit and loss model, the decisions around what will happen in the economy are essentially decentralized down to individual economic players. And so somebody wishing to buy something is attempting to make that purchase at the lowest possible price. And the person trying to sell it is trying to get the best possible price, and somewhere in between they meet. And the theory, at least, would be that both of them have maximized the value that they can get out of that transaction. And if the transaction doesn't work, and the way of thinking of one of those parties doesn't work repeatedly, then they go out of business. And that's kind of the capitalist model. What is happening with industrial policy is a government intervention that says we can direct the thinking around those transactions better than the market could. And there are certainly market failures, so we don't want to ignore those. But when we have an industrial policy, we're saying that we can direct this better than the market can direct it. And whether that's accurate or not, we're going to talk about a little today. Importantly, when we move to this sort of model, we of course have to deal with the information question. In other words, the people that are directing the market, do they have adequate information to be able to make these decisions? And bear in mind, the decisions ultimately are driven by the democratic process. In other words, through the politicians that are there, rather than a team of incredibly bright economists and industrial engineers and all sorts of other people. Ultimately, the direction is driven by a political process, and political processes are inherently short-term. And so along with all of this, we have to think about what occurs when we have these interventions. Are they in the long-term interest or in the short-term political interest? And that becomes quite pertinent in South Africa as we run up to the ANC's elective conference in December. So where does localization fit into all of this? And localization is essentially our industrial policy. So this comes out of the statement made by Minister Patel last year. A focus on localization is therefore at the heart of government strategy to create sustainable jobs for South Africa and build the economic base for long-lasting prosperity. And that's quite obviously an important objective. Creating sustainable jobs in a country like South Africa is absolutely crucial, with just terrifyingly large numbers of unemployed people in South Africa, and really a number where we're not making much of a dent in at the moment. We're also just going to talk, this comes out of a paper I just read as recently as yesterday, and this is from Professor Michael Munger at Duke University, and he makes just a very interesting comment here. He says, the reason politics is corruptible is that politicians have put themselves in the business of selling off policy to the highest bidder. The profit test version of an industrial plan would require a constitutional straitjacket constraining subsidies and differential tax rates to zero. And so what he's saying here, that if profitability of our industry is the primary objective, then the distortions that our policies put into the market would have to be tempered. We would, if profitability was it, we wouldn't want to be subsidizing, creating differential tax rates. He then says the configuration of political rent seeking we now observe in the industrial economy is not what happens when the profit test is used, but rather is what happens when corporate interests are allowed, and in many cases actively invited, to go shopping for artificial rents. Once rents are for sale, it is no great leap to predict that they will go to the highest bidder. And this, by the way, is written on the American system, not about South Africa. So what forms do localization take in South Africa? Well, there really are three primary forms. There's designation, which we're not really going to spend a lot of time on today, but designation is all about government procurement and trying to direct when government purchases to be purchasing domestically produced goods and services made from domestically generated raw materials as far as possible. There's import replacement to the private sector, and this is typically dealt with by applying duties. So whether they be normal customs duties, anti-dumping duties, etc., but there's some mechanism to try to drive procurement in the private sector to be buying local. And then export control of raw materials. This is something that I don't believe is yet arisen to a large degree. We see it with the proposed ban on scrap metal, for example. But there's also discussions afoot to apply export duties to chrome ore. A number of years ago, Minister Rob Davies wanted to look at an export duty on iron ore. So in some way, trying to keep the important raw materials in South Africa, beneficiate them here in some way before we export them. And then a comment that was made recently by Mteto Nyati, the Eskom director, which has become quite exciting in the media, but he says procurement rules are not as agile as they should be, including rules which say you cannot use suppliers that are not local. When the supplier of equipment is an international company, you have to use middlemen to satisfy the localization rule. Nyati said there's no place for these rules at Eskom, given its precarious position. And so here we see a state-owned entity starting to look a lot more critically at whether this is or isn't a good idea. And I'm almost done with my talking, and then we'll hop into the discussion with Paul. But one of the challenges you have with a typical localization model, this is not a South African issue at all, but you have a balance to be obtained between localization, which is essentially about import replacement, and export growth. And the problem is that the sort of bottom right-hand part of this triangle, which is the competition problem. So the more you localize, the more you remove competition from the market. As you remove competition from the market, you become less competitive, making exports ever more difficult to do. When you can't export, you're under increased pressure to sell your excess production locally. And again, because you are not as globally competitive as you should be, there's increased pressure to keep removing the global competition from the market. So that's the balance that has to be achieved. And I'm not saying it's unachievable, but just that is the balance that we have to look at. And so one of the prices you pay for any kind of localization initiative, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, is that it doesn't naturally coexist with competitiveness. So if we look at localization or industrial policy more broadly, we look at the success stories that are often touted globally, China, South Korea in 1960, Singapore, etc. These were regions with authoritarian governments. And of course, in the case of China, we still have that. So the ability to enforce, in other words, to not have to deal with the democratic process, which says unpopular policies are not going to be allowed to thrive. So difficult in a democracy to get that strict legal enforcement going properly. You've got to, in some way, legalize anti-competitive behavior. And this has already happened. So if we look at last year, October, the Competition Commission published a guideline, which was implemented earlier this year, that essentially says the typical rules that will bind the Competition Commission's concerns. In most transactions, you can be a little more lenient on those if the reason for getting together with your competitors is around a localization goal. So you've got to find a way for people to cooperate. And of course, we have our master plans, which is essentially a forum where you can put people together. Of course, I'm not suggesting that the master plans are creating an anti-competitive environment, but simply factually that you are putting people in a room and have to kind of deal with the legal risk of doing that. And then how do you grow your exports? Well, if you look at the Chinese model, in order to compensate for the inherent problems that flow out of it, China subsidizes, and the subsidies offset the cost of how you have set up by forcing certain behavior locally. And so those are my comments. I think you could tell exactly which direction I lean with this, but I am very open-minded to the idea that of course, we do have a problem, and our industry is failing consistently, and we are struggling to compete. So I do accept there's an argument for the other side of this, but I'm gonna for a moment keep quiet, and I just want to ask you, Paul. You've dealt with transactions where localization requirements have been inserted. What has your experience been of that process? What do you see working in that process, and what do you think is problematic?
Thank you, Donald. I suppose a sort of couple of observations. The first is, and just for the benefit of all participants, to the extent they don't know this, but the South African competition or takeover regime has two components to it. On the one hand, pure antitrust, as you'd see in many other markets around the world, and on the other hand, public interest matters. And I suppose, like your point about localization and export competitiveness not naturally coexisting, there's a natural tension between those two aspects. But what it does mean is that anything that is in the public interest, and I'll come back to that in a moment, is something that is by legislation needs to be considered in approving a transaction or not. And what we've seen historically over the years is that public interest is really defined around employment. So, there's generally a moratorium on reducing jobs as a context in the context of a takeover, and in some cases, it sort of the period extended. So it was, you can't reduce jobs for 12 months. That's, in some cases gone up to 3 years. The second is around Black economic empowerment. And more recently, it's around localization. So what we're clear about is in any merger approval process in a South African context, those three are the key focus areas from a public interest perspective. And obviously, in addition to that, you have the true antitrust. So what we've seen is increasingly commitments towards localization, either in the form of procurement requirements, so taking a baseline of what the particular merged entities' local procurement is today, and a commitment to increase that over time. And we've even seen examples where there's been a commitment to fund localization initiatives. So setting up a fund specifically to support technical analysis around localization. So that's just some examples of some of the conditions that have been handed down by the competition authorities from a localization perspective. What we've certainly observed in some of them is in the consumer space is that merger parties have agreed to increase local procurement, and in many cases that's been broadly positive because I think if one had to go back in time, there'd been very little procurement of a particular product or sub-product in the value chain, and getting local participation is useful, primarily in the agri space more than anything else. The other side is committing towards some sort of localization initiative and these funds. And I'm not sure that that's achieved a hell of a lot yet, because it's almost tantamount to writing out a check. And all you do is you write out a check, you commit to contribute towards these initiatives, but you actually don't see what the end outcome is. And so that's sort of a long way of saying that we've seen localization increasingly become an important aspect in merger approvals under the public interest banner. We've seen different forms of it, and I think we've seen a mixed bag of outcomes. I think what is important, though, is any localization initiative in the context of a merger sort of approval process needs to be based on sound economic or industrial logic. So, taking, company A who's buying out company B and telling the merged entity, you need to increase localization from X to Y, is on paper fine. But if there's no market for it, or if there's no supply for it, or if there's no sort of economic rationale behind it, then I think it's just a sort of a forced outcome, which doesn't have long-term benefits for the particular industry. And so I don't think it's a cookie-cut approach. I don't think it should be. But that's I think, sadly, where we're seeing it happening. We're seeing it almost with all the transactions, some requirement of some localization, but not on a sustainable basis, because invariably these commitments are commitments for a year, 2, 3 years, and then you're free to operate as you see appropriate. So that's really what we're seeing as this evolves over the last couple of years.
So, Paul, when if we for a moment just separate out a purely domestic transaction, let's say the two domestic producers of a product and the one wants to purchase the other, and we separate that from a global transaction, what is the response from the foreign companies who are involved with these transactions, either as buyers or sellers? How do they feel about these localization requirements, and does it affect the value of the transaction?
So I think that as a general rule, either buyers or sellers really want certainty on an outcome, and so the one issue that we do face is the competition authority is essentially implementing industrial policy through antitrust processes, which is just using that avenue to be able to implement industrial policy. And so I think that what buyers and sellers really want is certainty, where they have visibility on what the requirements are and the ability to deliver on those requirements. But what does happen is these are almost bespoke commitments. Well, they are bespoke commitments, and that's unhelpful. Does it impact price? Absolutely. I think that the foreign buyers look at this, or indeed any buyers for that matter, look at this and say, these are commitments we're going to make over the next 2 to 3 years, and we're going to factor into the cost. And so it does impact value off the top of it, because other than for the condition, they wouldn't be doing it. And so they just factor it into the price.
Yeah, so it's interesting because we see on the trade side of things, in fact, you used the term public interest. So public interest, in fact, has been used in exactly the opposite way in the context of duty changes. So there was the domestic poultry industry applied for anti-dumping duties against Brazil and some European countries, and ITAC took a decision that they should get those duties. But then when it got to Minister Patel, he turned around and said, no, this is not in the public interest with food inflation, where it is that in fact didn't impose the duties. So he suspended imposition of the duties for a year, which is it's a very unusual kind of step to take. It's not something we've ever seen before. And yeah, it's curious. On the other hand, we have something brand new, which has also been introduced in the course of this year on the trade side of things, called reciprocal agreements. And here what happens is you would apply to ITAC and you'd say, I want to get the duties removed on a raw material that I can't get locally, or I want to increase the duties, whatever the case might be. And you would have the decision taken, and then you would be presented with a contract that you need to sign. And the contract would typically tie you in to some kind of price control, employment levels, investment that you might need to make in your plant, etc. So you're having to lock yourself in, which is quite interesting, because in the past you would have to give your best estimates 3 years into the future. But now, of course, what's occurred is you have to lock it in contractually. And as you can well imagine, contracting to this for 3 years is a very, very different prospect to giving your best estimate. And so we now have a new game afoot around this, which is you don't disclose the full value of what your projections would look like, so that you can tie yourself in to a lesser commitment. But of course, that has implications on the adjudication process at ITAC, who may decide to not grant whatever it is you're applying for, because the numbers don't stack up. So we've ended up in a very kind of peculiar position around all of this, where we've created so much enforcement around these projections, rather than asking the more kind of fundamental question, which might be, does it make sense economically to increase these duties or to remove them, whatever the case might be. We now kind of have a very transactional view on this, where it's no longer what makes sense, but what can be extracted as part of the process. And I think it creates problems with the instrument itself. So if you're kind of almost buying the concession that you want by, let's say it's a duty removal and you can't get the product locally, and now you're essentially having to pay for that. It's created a very peculiar situation between the applicant companies and government. And then, of course, the companies that are penalized most for this are the guys who put their hands up. So whoever steps forward and says, I want to do something, are the guys who have to make the commitment. The people that may compete with them but are not active applicants, are almost rewarded for not being a participant, because they're not tied into the same commitment. So the whole thing has become incredibly complicated. And I'm not sure it's terribly productive, truth be told.
I mean, that certainly applies in the M&A world, because as I said earlier on, the problem is that merger approval processes are being used as an instrument to implement industrial policy, but it's done on an ad hoc basis. What I mean by that is it only applies when there's merger control requirements. And so, only when you're acquiring a business or selling a business does it become relevant. What that does then create is a peculiarity, in the sense that certain market participants are subjected to conditions for a period of time that don't apply to other market participants. So the most classic example of that was when Walmart came into South Africa almost 10 years ago, in fact, more than 10 years ago, to acquire a controlling stake in Massmart. And the big contentious issue there was the use of Walmart's global supply chain and the impact that would have on local industry. And so the remedy that was initially proposed was a remedy of constraining Massmart procurement to just local suppliers. And of course, that in and of itself is anti-competitive, and that's the sort of dichotomy that exists between those two aspects. But it's anti-competitive because you're saying to one market participant, you can only acquire local, whereas everyone else could acquire from the cheapest producer wherever they may be situated. And so the way we came around that is we said, well, let's rather contribute towards a fund whose purpose would be to try and develop a local supply chain. So the idea being that you've got small up-and-coming producers of whatever product, and obviously as a retailer, there's a very large supply chain, but help them get up the curve, as it were, to become suppliers in the future. So the instrument that was used there was not to curtail local procurement, but rather try and develop a supply chain over time, and therefore it's sort of less anti-competitive. But I think what sort of flows from that is that in all major mergers, the idea of a fund and some contribution towards a fund is almost common cause. Where I think we sort of miss a trick here is the purpose of the fund, because I think what happens is that the view is, and the default position is, we're trying to get a merger through. We need to make some sort of commitment, writing out a check towards a fund, whatever that fund might do, is almost secondary. And then we get the approval. So it's not too dissimilar to the point you just made, which is, sort of you in inverted commas, buy your way to some sort of approval. But I think where the logic falls down is that the purpose of the fund needs to be, sort of well thought through. I think it needs to be technically sound, and it needs to focus on trying to achieve an outcome that is long lasting and for the benefit of the economy, whatever that might be. But at the moment, what I think it is, generally speaking, is just a commitment to write out a check over a period of time and then get your approval and move on with life. And I think that that's a big issue, because I think that creates sort of, incongruent incentives here. And I think we're missing a trick. So I think that applies, clearly on the trade side, but equally on the M&A side, where there's sort of bespoke responses to particular merger requirements. But
then don't we, with all of that happening, do we not end up, if I look at BEE, for example, what's happened with BEE from when it's first implemented, and I guess BEE might be considered just an extremely focused localization policy on one particular racial group in South Africa. But the effect of BEE was to create a couple of very big winners, but a relatively insignificant impact on the vast majority. And do we not run a risk with the localization rules that we start to create kind of a group of oligarchs, maybe not as bad as Russia, but a similar kind of situation where the people who understand how to navigate the localization, understand how to kind of get their hands on the best transactions. See, if I have a look, we've dealt with quite a number of transactions where I've been quite stunned at the same people's names popping up repeatedly across sectors that would appear to have nothing to do with each other, and essentially just being passive recipients of equity by understanding how the system works. And I do concern myself that what we end up with here is rather than any kind of large-scale localization effort going to if I look at Michael's question, Michael will come to you in a moment. Michael's question on, you're a steel fabricator. There are lots of steel fabricators in South Africa. Those are not the ones that are necessarily going to be getting the attention. And so it's, who are the companies? How do you benefit from this? I think becomes increasingly complicated, because it feels as if you you have a group of people who understand. The example I often give, if we look at the master plans, is there are some people that are in the room and are part of the master plan, and then there are other people that don't know there is a room. And so that is problematic. Then we end up with an uneven ability to influence policy. We end up with a very uneven distribution of information. And that, of course, creates a very uneven competitive playing field over time. So where we move to the point where there's kind of a very active engagement with a particular sector, for example, where the decision is we are going to grow this sector, we should probably realize that in the process of picking a winner, by default, you're perhaps inadvertently also picking a group of losers. And I'm not sure that trade-off is always as obvious. It's I think we have winners that are very clear, but sometimes the losers are kind of many but smaller, and so we almost socialize away the cost of the losses. And so whoever wins very big, but it's a small number of people, and everyone else kind of covers the cost of those wins. I'm not sure if that's a bit cynical, Paul, but that's how it feels to me at the moment.
Well, certainly. I mean, I think, again, applying that to sort of merger approvals, I think there needs to be a distinction between, the public interest benefit or harm caused by a merger. So if company A were to acquire company B, and regardless of whether company A will be, is international or not,
Yes.
if two companies are going to merge, I think the test needs to focus on what is the harm, public interest harm, of that transaction going through. And I think that's absolutely legitimate, and I think that's the right approach. What I do think, however, happens in reality is, and it comes back to the point we've now discussed, which is using instruments like merger control to implement trade policy or industrial policy, is that it actually tries to enhance the public benefit aspect of it as opposed to minimize the harm. And I think there's a clear distinction between that. So I do think that we do run the risk of having a sort of focused implementation based on mergers, as opposed to universal implementation of industrial policy, if it makes sense. In other words, start at the beginning, understand what the objectives are, understand the economic rationale, and then implementing it universally across the industry. I think what we are ending up doing is doing it on a, as I said, bespoke or ad hoc basis, which by definition creates a very concentrated effort in a particular industry. So, if company A wasn't going to acquire company B, that condition wouldn't be on the table, and therefore that situation wouldn't arise. And I think that's the risk we face here. I think that if we look at it from, if company A had to acquire company B and there were, on the face of it, public interest or localization or negative impacts of that, then certainly that needs to be remedied through conditions. But driving industrial policy through merger conditions, I think creates an extortion, sort of, unevenness, I suppose is probably the better way to put it, in the market. So absolutely, I completely agree. I think that it can be counterproductive and create, undue concentration in particular areas.
Yeah, so it's interesting because Minister Patel made an interesting announcement, I think it was earlier this year or possibly in the course of last year, where he put out some numbers and then kind of spoke about how South Africa has an unusually high percentage of our GDP accounted for in the form of imports. Why are imports such a large percentage? And we need to reduce that number. And I thought that was a very interesting comment, because I think it might in some way kind of describe the thinking in government, which I think has the cart and the horse in the wrong order here. So to a large degree, the conversation we're not having about localization, I think, is the question of competitiveness. I mean, let's be very clear. every time you concentrate a market, you push up prices. And by the way, that is very often the stated intention. So for example, it's not uncommon to see a company that is applying for more import duties to say the reason they're asking for it is they want to put their prices up, and they can't. And this was most clearly stated in the recent tire anti-dumping investigation, where the Ford tires producers said, we have to have these duties because we can't raise our prices fast enough. And so the trade-off that I think everyone is aware of is that you are trading localization for inflation. And I think that's important to bear in mind. In the course of all of this, though, where the thinking that we should import less, and I have no problem with that as a premise, has got to be connected to the basics of the country working properly. So every time we do an import, we're also importing someone else's functioning electricity, their roads that work, and all of the other things that work in that economy. And every time we lose an export deal, it's because we have to also export the cost of Eskom not working, our ports falling over, etc. And so I would think perhaps the most important thing we have to get right if localization is going to work is we have to deal with the thing that is the most important thing for governments to do, which is to create the infrastructural base for the economy to work, to enforce the rule of law, etc. Because irrespective of which sectors you might pick as a winner, no sector benefits from our electricity situation. There isn't a single sector that is better off with municipalities that steal all the money and things don't work properly. Nobody benefits from an education system that doesn't work. And I do appreciate that's not necessarily a problem the DTIC can fix. But I do think if we can't get those basics operating, the things that make for a functional state, then it becomes very difficult to tack on all of the other bits. You can't fix the roads by applying a higher duty to imported goods. And particularly, if we have a look at our imports of material, for many products, despite the fact that there are very high duties and we have a weak currency at the moment, the imports don't disappear, which tells us that there's another problem underpinning all of this that is bigger than just the fact that we should be buying less imported goods. And I think as we head into an economic situation that is incredibly grim at the moment, we're going to find Minister Patel faced with having to deal with these trade-offs more directly as he did with chicken. And even if the domestic chicken industry thinks it was a bad idea, and I think it was a good idea, the fact is that that decision is no longer something that can be ignored. It's something which is having to be confronted. If we look at the comment from the Eskom director, much the same thing. We can no longer pretend that for every policy we put forward, there is simply never a cost to that. And I think government is having to confront the reality of how to adjudicate that cost. And I'm not saying that the decision to localize is a good one or a bad one at a micro level, but just that I think that the cost of that has got to be tallied up. In fact, before we open the floor, Paul, I wanted to ask you something. You mentioned the funds which are just nowadays deemed to be part of a transaction. But what is the outcome been of those funds? Is there any kind of measure that looks at 100 million that has been put aside and says, this is kind of what has happened? Or is that simply an expense that is written off, and after the money has been put down, there's no tracking of really what the return is like on that?
So I think there has been some, there certainly have been some positive outcomes in the sense that the money's been well spent. There's sort of bang for your buck, and I'm generalizing here. And it's certainly an area that's been focused on from a monitoring point of view. time will tell whether long term that's sort of created outcomes that are sustainable, because I think sort of market economics are such that you remove any sort of artificial assistance or support over a period of time, and I think market forces will be what they become. And so it's something that is monitored. It's not always sustainable, I don't think, but it sort of begs the question, and I think this whole localization focus needs to be underpinned by, certainly in my mind, hard economics and industrial logic, because I do think that if we take the view that localization is good, and therefore we as in government takes the view that localization is good, and therefore they want to drive it because the benefits are substantial from job creation perspective and the like, I think we can't do it in the absence of an assessment around competition and figure out, what industries do we have a competitive advantage versus those that we don't, and such that once you've implemented a localization policy, it has long-term benefits. If you just think about electricity as just one example, it wasn't too long ago where we were a massive exporter of electricity in the form of aluminium, because that's what we did. Ultimately, we had these aluminium smelters that were exporting electricity. They weren't exporting aluminium. That's sort of a byproduct in its odd way. That avenue no longer exists at the moment. The constraints in our infrastructure around ports is yet another example of where accessing international markets is a constraint for us. And so I think there's two aspects. The point that you made around making sure the basics work, so the infrastructure is available to be able to deliver the output that is required. And the second is making sure there's sort of robust industrial logic to the intentions here of trying to create a localization policy which benefits the country in areas that we can make a difference. So, as I said, with energy, many years ago, we could make a difference. I don't think we can do that now. And so I think a more robust assessment needs to be had of what sectors within the economy we can really focus on localization, as opposed to areas where we will, as much as we wish and want, we'll never get there. And I think that's the clear piece. And I'm not sure, and I could be wrong, but I'm not sure much work's gone into working out where the competitiveness really lies for South Africa and where we should be focusing our localization initiatives. And those where we don't see we've got any competitive advantage, we certainly shouldn't try and interfere, because I don't think it gives a sustainable outcome that drives the economic outlook that we all want and need.
I'm going to open the floor to questions, and Michael, rather than read your quite lengthy question, would you like to quickly describe your problem, and then we can talk about it? So that's Michael Perimal. Yeah.
Hi, good morning.
Morning, Michael.
Morning.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, so my question is, obviously based around the steel and construction industry, and you obviously touched on the BE aspect as well. But we've sat in so many of these kind of sessions where it talks about localization and supporting local, and in terms of the larger kind of projects in the market, we always seem to see international companies getting the first bite in terms of these larger projects, be it supply, be it fabrication, or whatever the case is. So yeah, it's just a bit of a concern. There's obviously policies in place, from a government point of view and so on. But yeah, it's in most cases we don't really kind of see the local companies or fabricators getting a fair chance. I obviously understand when you look at international companies, in terms of the support that they receive from their specific government. So, that could be a stumbling block for South Africa. And, we don't kind of see that support coming from the South African government in assisting the local companies in the same way.
So, Michael, are you referring to supplying private sector projects or supplying government projects?
So it's mainly in the private sector. If you look at the larger I think from a government's point of view, I think, we obviously supply government institutes directly. They seem to have some sort of clamp on that, but it's more on the private kind of sector. So look, I understand there's lots of rules and regulations. Pricing is obviously a huge factor as well in any kind of project. So yeah, but the question is centered mainly around the private sector.
Yeah, so for the private sector side of things, the government's kind of favorite lever to pull here is to impose duties on the imported goods in some way. That can work to a point, but it depends specifically on the product. But what we're finding is that the duties become ineffective when the additional costs of an ineffective state exceed the value of the duty. So, for example, if the cost of you having irregular access to electricity or water, whatever else it is that you may need, and you now have to kind of compensate by putting in a generator or some such thing, what eventually happens is the 10% duty that gets applied to the imports just is not enough to overcome all of the other problems. And yeah, I mean, my comment would be, without understanding the detail of your matter, is, government typically deals with this by imposing duties. I have a view that is largely becoming ineffective, but that is the path that they deal with. We can't compel companies in South Africa to have to buy from local suppliers. On government contracts, of course, they have this process of designation, but also there, Michael, there's very little evidence that designation has actually delivered much. Many municipalities, SOEs apply for exemptions. It's almost impossible to enforce. So it's questionable if those processes work, but be that as it may, I mean, those are kind of the two mechanisms. Nati.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Nati, you had a question for Paul?
I don't know if Nati is still on, but I can see the question on the screen.
Oh, excellent. Yes.
So Nati, for everyone's benefit, your question is, you've got an international supplier, effectively, with a local subsidiary that wants to acquire your products, but you're concerned that international headquarters would insist that they use international suppliers. What can be done? I mean, I'm intrigued about your point around reducing price, because it sounds like you're not as price competitive as what the international suppliers might be. So I think that obviously that is a lever in and of itself. But there's really two aspects. The first is price. The second is quality of supply and certainty of supply. And so to the extent that you can produce, the product at the right spec or better at a price that matches, then, there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be procuring from you, even if the international headquarters would argue against it, because in reality, from an economic point of view, you're providing the right quality at the right price. And that's, I think, what makes sense. What government will try and do to assist, I suppose, is come in with import duties, as Donald just mentioned. But the question is, is that a viable long-term solution, or is your ability to produce, the right spec at the right price and the right quantity going to outweigh an import? And it should do. It absolutely should do. I don't know if that's helped answer your question. I see you're on.
Yeah, it does, Paul. Thank you. It's an issue that was raised by local subsidiary to say we can, but this is the concern we have. We haven't tested it yet. I just wanted to see if there are any pointers that I can get from the dialogue.
Yeah, that would be my view. I mean, I think that it's worth seeing if you can get there on price, and then there shouldn't be any reason why they're not procuring from you.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
Jerry, to your question on localization, mitigating against supply chain risks, I'll hand the microphone to you in a second, but I think the whole ideas around nearshoring, etc., particularly after COVID, when we saw supply chains disrupted, My take on this is that the market is sending an enormous signal by way of these crazy freight costs and all the rest of it. So I think, and many companies, of course, got terribly burnt in the process of not being able to secure supply. I don't know that you need to have active localization policies in order to achieve the objective that many of those companies want to de-risk and not get caught in that way. So I think there's a natural and a good reason to not do that and not just keep buying abroad. The problem we have in South Africa is that just the size of our economy is absolutely tiny. And it becomes, the smaller economies become, the more dependent you automatically become on global trade, because we have a tiny market to sell to, and we only have so many things that we can manufacture locally. And of course, over time, we've also deindustrialized, as many other countries have, and shifted their economies to service economies. So there, I think there will globally, and there's already a trend for companies to bring more of their operations onshore. And so I think that would happen, but I think the degree that can happen here is difficult. The attraction of bringing more of your production into South Africa when you can't get electricity to the current factory you have, I would think that would make for a fairly tough discussion to have with the board of directors to say we need to put more capital here. My experience at the moment is there is a trade-off between the global supply chain problems and the domestic economic risks, and I think that is a trade-off that is happening in a lot of board of directors at the moment. Certainly, I'm in conversations with companies that are not making investment at the moment and continuing to import because they are concerned that the situation we have in South Africa is not going to be fixed within the time frame that they need it to be in order to make their investment as profitable as it could be. Jerry, does it kind of answer your question? I apologize, I sort of took over your question and answer. Or would you like to add to that? Jerry, I think you're muted. Jerry, we'll come back to you if you want to kind of build on what I've stated. Then we have an anonymous attendee. I'm too nervous to ask who that might be. Would you like to state your question, or shall I read it out? All right. Is localization achieving its intended objectives of attracting investment to boost local production and by extension competitiveness? Paul, maybe you should take that question first.
So I'm not sure that when you refer to attracting investment, you're referring to local or international. In other words, the investors are either local players or international players. If it is international players, I don't think we've got a whole bunch of international players that are investing because they see this localization initiative as an important piece, and it's attracting investment. I think there's a whole host of other factors that influence the investment decision, and localization is just one factor. But I think a lot of the points we've already discussed around the basic infrastructure is really what's at the heart of the investment decision, where there'll be a return on investment. So I don't think the policy in and of itself is attracting investment. The intention may very well be that we'll hope over time that it does attract investment, but I think there's other factors that are disencouraging investment. Would be my sense of it.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. Thokozani, you have a question.
Hi, hello.
There we go. Hello.
First of all, I just wanted to say thank you, gentlemen, for this very informative platform. Most of my experience is sort of more on a customs and excise sort of platform. So to be involved in something like this is very, very, very awesome for me. What I just wanted to find out was around the sort of, I heard Donald speaking about sort of challenges when it comes to production here in SA, for example, like load shedding, and then that sort of translates to sort of if you're trying to do like a whole localization system, sort of when you're imposing duties on your imports, you know, it sort of becomes like a null factor now because of all the other challenges that you have in your production here locally. I don't know if I understood that properly before I carry on with my question.
Yes, I would say that is a correct understanding.
Okay, cool. So now I want to look at sort of the tires story now, or the tires situation currently here in SA with the whole provisional payments for that anti-dumping duty, you know.
Yes.
And sort of maybe say, or maybe try if you can maybe put it into any sort of words, if the whole idea of localization, has it sort of had, was it the idea when they sort of imposed these anti-dumping duties on the tires? And secondly, I saw that you said that well, I've read one of your blog posts before, I think, where you said about only we only produce about 20% of the tires used in SA, you know, and the rest is subsidized by imports, you know, and sort of what all of that has, and sort of like how does it sort of affect this whole thing around tires and sort of the duties being imposed there and sort of local production and what it actually means for the consumer. I hope I articulated that properly.
You did well. So with tires, it's a particularly unusual case because there's billions of rands that we're talking about in trade here. So it's a large, you know, high impact kind of investigation. So the effect is likely to play out as follows. So from a consumer perspective, the cost will go up. There's very little way to avoid a price increase if you've levied a large duty on an item. That item is going to become more expensive. And like I said, when the applicants in this case for domestic producers brought their case, they were quite explicit about the fact that they wanted the price increase. And so I think that's exactly what we are likely to see. The question would be, and you're absolutely right, there's in and about 20% of the models of tire that we consume in South Africa are produced locally, and the domestic industry imports about 80% of the models that they sell. And again, this is not a secret. I mean, this is kind of very publicly stated by them. So the question would then be, what are we trying to achieve here? Well, the thinking seems to be that the imports have had an impact of keeping their prices low. So this is not so much about the fact that the domestic industry is going to change and begin only importing 30% of the tires that they sell, but it's more about the fact that the imports are not allowing them to move their prices up as much as their costs are rising. And so they would like to retain their margin. And in order to do that, they've got to in some way create a handicap, if you like, for the imports. And so that, by the way, is a fairly common trope to find out that you're not crazy about the competition. You can't do that in the local market. I mean, just imagine for a moment that ShopRite said we like to preserve a higher margin, and so we want to make sure that Pick n Pay and Woolies, etc., all have to have a premium added onto their product in order so that we can all keep our margin. I mean, that's almost the very definition of anti-competitive behavior. But there is a kind of get out of jail free card if you do exactly that across the border. And that's essentially what the domestic tire producers are attempting to do, is to take competition out, which is inhibiting their ability to put their prices up. So when we look at products like this, the problem with a product like tires, particularly when you apply that thinking, is I'm less concerned, although somewhat irritated when I replace my next set of tires on my car, but the duty and the cost increase on tires for me will only go as far as me. The problem is when you apply that to the taxi industry, the logistics sector, that means everything you put onto a truck, every person who goes to work every day, all of those costs will be marginally inflated by adding this, and that has considerably more severe consequences, particularly when we're in a high inflation environment as we are now. So I don't know, Thokozani, if that answers your question on the tires, or if I've missed it, please let me know, and I'll have another go at it.
No, 100%, Donald. Thank you for that answer. It does answer my question. Thank you so much.
Welcome. Any other questions? Otherwise, we're going to be wrapping up.
All right, sorry to disturb. Is it okay if I just leave now? I've got another meeting that I need to attend to, please.
You're welcome. So everyone that's attended, you'll be sent an email with a copy of the recording when it's uploaded to our YouTube page, and a copy of the presentation. If you want to get hold of any of us, you're more than welcome to. So thank you once again, Paul, and thank you so much for taking a bit of time out of your day to join me.
Thank you, and thank you to all the participants.